In the previous lesson, we studied the contraction of the gastrointestinal smooth muscle and the motility of the esophagus and stomach. Today, we'll be focusing on the motility patterns of the small and large intestines. Let's start with the small intestine. Just like the stomach, there are two motility phases, the digestive phase and the interdigestive phase. In each of these phases, the motility pattern changes. First, let's look at the digestive phase. This phase occurs when food is being digested in the intestine. There are two types of motility here, propulsive and non-propulsive movements, with non-propulsive movements also referred to as segmentation. Segmentation occurs through contractions of the inner circular muscle. Segments of about 3 to 4 centimeters contract, dividing the intestine into contracted and relaxed areas. Then, the contracted parts relax, and the relaxed parts contract, moving the contents back and forth. These movements help mix the contents with intestinal secretions and allow the material to come into contact with the absorptive surface. This type of motility increases the transit time. It's important to note that the contents entering the small intestine are mostly liquid. Propulsive movement, on the other hand, is characterized by peristaltic contractions that push the contents forward, although they only cover short distances before segmentation movements take over again. Some authors describe this movement during the digestive phase as 2 steps forward, 1 step back. When propulsive movements dominate, the transit time shortens. The interdigestive phase occurs during fasting or between meals, and it's quite similar to what happens in the stomach, as we covered in the last lesson. During this phase, several peristaltic waves originate in the duodenum and travel long distances down the small intestine, sometimes even reaching the end of the intestine. These waves are called the migrating myoelectric complex or migrating motor complex. The function of these contractions is to push undigested material into the large intestine and regulate the bacterial population. The bacterial count is relatively low in the duodenum and increases as you move toward the ileum, where it becomes more abundant. This balance needs to be maintained, and the migrating myoelectric complex plays a key role in that. The junction between the ileum and the cecum is regulated by the ileocecal sphincter. This sphincter remains closed most of the time, preventing the contents of the large intestine from flowing back into the small intestine. When the contents need to pass from the ileum to the cecum, the sphincter relaxes. However, once the large intestine begins its movements, the sphincter closes again to prevent reflux. Now let's move on to the motility patterns of the colon. The function of this section of the intestine varies depending on the species. The colon is responsible for absorbing water and electrolytes, storing feces, and fermenting organic matter that wasn't digested in the small intestine. In some species, like horses and rabbits, the large intestine is extensive and complex due to the importance of fermentation. The nutrients they need come from this fermentation process. This is quite different from carnivores like dogs and cats, which don't rely on fermentation and have a less complex colon. Despite these anatomical differences, the motility patterns are similar. The colon can perform segmentation movements to mix the contents, as well as peristalsis and antiperistalsis. In dogs and cats, there are pacemaker cells located between the transverse and descending colon that generate slow waves during resting periods. These waves cause antiperistaltic activity in the transverse colon, which leads to the accumulation of some of the contents in the ascending colon and cecum. Meanwhile, the descending colon exhibits moderate peristaltic activity. The material entering this section is liquid, but the colon performs segmentation movements to absorb water and electrolytes, mainly under the influence of aldosterone. As a result, the material becomes semi-solid, eventually forming feces. When we consider herbivores, their cecum and colon are more developed. Let's use horses as an example. In horses, the cecum performs segmentation movements to mix the ingesta, and propulsive movements push large amounts of food into the colon. The colon also has a pacemaker in the pelvic flexure and exhibits segmentation, peristalsis, and antiperistalsis, similar to what we see in dogs and cats. At the end of the digestive tract, the anus has 2 sphincters, an internal sphincter made of smooth muscle and an external sphincter made of striated muscle. The internal sphincter is responsible for maintaining fecal continence. For feces to enter the rectum, the internal sphincter must relax while the rectum contracts with peristaltic movements. This is known as the recto-anal reflex. Typically, this reflex results in defecation, but the act can be controlled voluntarily by the external sphincter. That's all for this lesson. See you next time.